Hello and welcome to this painting tutorial where today I'm going to show you how to paint goblins. But not just any goblin, the one I'm painting in this video is a goblin from my own miniature collection, which is pretty exciting, I guess. No biggie. I'm going to be showing you how I painted his skin, teeth, eyes, and his big pink ears and nose so you can paint your own eye-catching goblins at home. Like I said, the mini I'm painting in this video is one of the goblins from my own collection. It's the little fishing goblin who's one of my favourites. But don't worry if you don't have access to that miniature just yet, because this colour scheme will look absolutely great on any goblin miniature you want to paint. I am obviously super excited to share this tutorial with you guys, so let's get right into it and start painting our goblins. The first thing we're going to do is base coat our goblin using a nice bright goblin-y green colour, and for that I'm using a 1:1 mix of Citadel Auric Flesh and Vallejo Flat Green. And with that we're going to do our usual base coating trick of applying 3 to 4 thin layers, letting our layers dry fully in between our applications until we have a good strong base colour all over the skin. Then when your base coat is smooth and dry, it's time to start adding some subtle shading to the miniature. And for this first shade, I'm going to go with something interesting. And I'm going to add some warmer tones to the skin by making a 1:1 mix of flat green and serpentine leather. We're going to thin this colour into a nice thin glaze using some water until it's watery but still pigmented. And start applying this shade very broadly into the recesses of the skin. We're going to apply a few glazes of this colour, focusing it steadily into darker and darker areas until it's most concentrated in the areas we want to be the darkest. We're going to repeat the previous stage now, but this time using a darker colour by mixing in a little bit of Vallejo Black Green into our previous paint mix. We're going to be focusing this colour into darker areas of the goblin skin details than we did in our previous step, but still using the same method of thinning it down into a glaze and applying it gradually into the more shadowy parts of the mini until it's darkest and most concentrated in those areas. For our third shade, we're going to be using some pure Vallejo Black Green, and again we're going to thin it down into a glaze and start focusing it into the darkest parts of the miniature's muscle and skin details using gradual thin layers. I'm really taking my time with these shades, especially around the face area, because particularly on this miniature, the face is super big and definitely the focal point of the whole piece. We're going to apply one more shade, but this one is going to be a significantly darker shade, and we're going to be using a 5:1 mix of Beal Tan Green and Black, which just means we're going to be adding a little bit of black to a whole lot of Beal Tan Green. And we're just going to be focusing this colour into the very deepest recesses of the miniature. This colour is already pretty thin, as it's mostly composed of a Citadel shade, but we're still going to thin this colour down just a tiny bit so we can focus the thin layers into the very small areas we want to put it. Like I said, this colour is only going into the deepest parts of the mini, so I'm applying this shade into areas like around his eyes, his horns, in between his fingers, and in his little butt crack too. Now that we've spent some time shading the miniature, it's time to start highlighting the skin back up to make it nice and bright. And our first colour is going to be a mix of Vallejo Flat Green and Citadel Everland Sunset. And again, we're mixing in more yellowy colours because I want my goblin to lean more towards grassy yellow tones. We're going to thin this paint mix down with a brush full of water and start broadly applying this colour into the higher parts of the miniature skin details, making sure we leave some of the original base colour and all that nice shading we built up still showing. We're going to build up a few thin layers until this colour is most concentrated in the lightest areas of the mini. We're going to build up our highlights a little further now by repeating the previous step, but this time adding in a little more Averland Sunset to the mix until it's 1 part Averland Sunset to 1 part Vallejo Flat Green. This time though, we're going to be concentrating this lighter yellowy green mix into even higher parts of the skin using thin layers, until we have a nice smooth gradient going from the darker to lighter greens on his skin, which, especially on this larger size of miniature, looks super cool and cartoony. We're going to use one more lighter paint mix to lighten the gradient a little bit more, and for that we're just going to add a little bit of Watercolor Sunburst Yellow into our previous mix to make a significantly lighter and much more saturated green tone. We're only going to focus this colour into the highest areas of our green gradient, in a few thin glazes to brighten up the lightest parts and make him look super saturated and bright. We're going to add a little bit more Sunburst Yellow into the mix and start using this lighter colour to add a bit more definition to the skin in some edge highlights. Now, I'm concentrating most of these edge highlights around his face to really make that area stand out. But that's because I designed this little guy to have a big old face, which also means I can get away with my edge highlights being a little bit bigger. If you're painting your own goblin at home, chances are it'll be a lot smaller than this guy, so just make sure you're using a nice pointed brush and your paints are nice and thin for this step. And take your time until all the areas of skin and muscle are well defined and edge highlighted. To finish off the green parts of the skin, we're going to add a few smaller edge highlights, which are almost point highlights to only the highest parts of the skin details. Again, I'm putting these point highlights within the edge highlights we did previously all over the goblin, but I'm going to be focusing mine mostly around the face area on details like the highest points of the skin around his horns, and on his eyebrows, cheekbones, and his chin as well. Just like before, I'm luckily painting quite a large miniature here, but if you're painting up a smaller goblin, try and make sure your point highlights are super small and only focused on the lightest and highest points of your miniature. Now, when I'm painting greenskins, one of my favourite things to do is to add in a bunch of organic looking red tones to the skin to give it a bit more contrast and dimension. That's why you'll probably have noticed in the previous step, I left some areas like his big ears and his big nose unpainted. Now, this stage is totally optional, but I really like the way it looks in the end, so I'm going to show you how I like to do it. We're going to start by base coating all the areas we want to be red using a few thin layers of Citadel Corn Red. I'm going to focus this colour on the ears and around his lips for now, and do his nose in a little bit because I'm going to be using slightly different colours for that. Once those areas are base coated, we're going to start adding just a little bit of Warcolor's bronzed flesh into our corn red, and apply this slightly lighter paint color into the higher parts of the red areas to start lightening and highlighting those areas up. In the ears especially, we're applying this initial pink color quite broadly, while still leaving a bit of corn red in the recesses. Remember to use nice thin paint so that you can gradually build up your layers until it's most concentrated in the areas you want to be the lightest. We're going to add a bit more bronzed flesh into our previous mix to make it just a little bit lighter and pinker, and start applying that in a similar way to our previous step, but this time more focused towards the higher and lighter parts of the red areas. For the ears especially, I'm focusing my layers gradually towards the end and the top of the ears to make a striking light to dark gradient in that area. Now that we've made a nice fleshy pink gradient on our red areas, it's time to define them using some edge highlights. We're going to use a 1-to-1 mix of corn red and bronze flesh for this step, to make some edge highlights on some of the highest and sharpest parts of the red areas. To make these areas really stand out, we're going to add a final point highlight using some bronze flesh to some select areas, like the highest areas under his eyes and the very tips of his big pink ears. After I'd finished, I decided that he needed a little bit more contrast in some of the recesses in his ears, so I added in a few thin down glazes of Doomfire Magenta contrast paint into some of the more shadowy areas. This stage is totally optional, but I think on this miniature especially, it helped a ton on some of the larger areas. Now, this guy's nose is a lot bigger and rounder than your average goblin's nose, and because of its shape and prominence on the miniature, I thought that I would paint it just ever so slightly differently from the other red areas. We're going to start again by base coating the nose using a few thin layers of corn red, and again we're going to build up our initial dark pink color by adding in just a little bit of bronzed flesh to the mix in the same way that we did before. After we've done that, we're going to be mixing up the same ratios of corn red and bronzed flesh as we did before, but this time we're going to be adding in just a little bit of Warcolor's titillating pink to the mix as well, just to make this colour a bit brighter and more saturated than our other areas. The important thing about painting this part of the miniature is that since it's very round, we're going to be highlighting this area like it's a sphere. So we're going to be applying our highlights in thin round shaped layers, which stack on top of each other gradually until they're lightest where the round shape would catch the light the most. We're going to finish off with a few edge highlights by adding in a little bit of Vallejo Off-White into our pink mix, and we're going to be applying those edge highlights to areas like the top of his nose bridge and the top of his nostrils. And then we're going to finish off by adding a few more point highlights using pure Off-White. There's one more detail which we're going to be painting a slightly different shade of red, and that's all these little spots and dots on my goblin skin. Your goblin may not have these, but mine does, so we're going to start by base coating them using corn red. Then we're going to use some Warcolor's blood red to highlight them, which is a much more orangey red than our previous pink coloured areas. To highlight them further, we're just going to add a little bit of bronze flesh to our blood red and add a little dot of this colour to the top of each one. Then we're going to finish off with an even smaller dot of pure bronze flesh. Next up, we're going to paint his teeth, horns, and tusks, and there's quite a few different methods for painting teeth and horns out there, but we're going to keep our ones quite smooth and gradienty to match the graphic paint job that we've done so far. We're going to start by base coating all the tooth and bone areas using Vallejo dark sand, and as usual we're going to be applying it in a few thin layers until we have a nice strong colour on all these areas. Then we're going to start shading each of the teeth and horns first by using some hobgrot hide, and we're going to be thinning down this paint into a glaze consistency with a brush full of water until the pigment is translucent and subtle. Once that layer is dry, keep applying more layers further and further down each section until the colour is pure hobgrot hide towards the bottom. Then we're going to repeat that step using some darker sandy bone coloured paints by thinning them down into glazes and steadily applying our layers further and further towards the bottom of the teeth and horns until it's the darkest shade at the very bottom. If you're patient with your glazing and your layering, then what you'll end up with is a really smooth gradient even on the larger areas. Then we're going to dip back into our dark sand paint and start applying some very subtle lines which start around halfway down each of the teeth to make those little ridges you see sometimes on things like horns and teeth. This is totally optional and you can just keep applying these later stages as thin glazes, but I quite like adding a little bit of texture in at this stage. We're going to keep building up those little line ridges on each tooth and horn by applying a slightly lighter paint within the previous lines, but this time more concentrated towards the tip of each area. And then we're going to finish off with a few final little lines of off-white right at the very top of each piece. Now it's time to paint what's probably my favourite part of the whole miniature, which is this goblin's big expressive eyes. Now, I designed this goblin to be slightly larger so that painting eyes wouldn't be as hard or intimidating for new painters, but you can use this recipe to paint expressive goblin eyes in any size that you like. We're going to start by base coating the whole eyeball area using Celestra Grey. As usual, we're going to be using a few thin layers until we have a nice solid base coat. Then we're going to highlight the eyeballs in a spherical fashion in the same way that we did with the nose, using lighter and lighter mixes of Celestra Grey and white until it's pure white in the highest and the roundest part of the shape. I also went back into one of the mid-grey mixes and used that to add a little bit of a reflective shine to the bottom of each eye to make them look a bit watery and shinier. On this mini, the iris is slightly sculpted, so I'm going to follow that outline to add in the blue colour into his eyes. And for that, we're going to start by base coating this area using a dark blue colour. Then we're going to repeat that step, but add an even lighter shade of blue into the middle of the eye. And then we're going to finish off with a shiny highlight of pure white right at the very top of each eye. Now, goblins don't typically have fur, but my one certainly does, and I really like the way it turned out, so I'm going to run you through how I did this step as a bit of an added bonus. We're going to start by base coating the whole fur area using a beigey grey mix of paints, and this area of fur is pretty large, so this stage took me some time, but as usual, just make sure you apply 3 to 4 thin layers until you've built up to a strong, smooth base coat. After that, we're going to start subtly shading our fur using a slightly darker shade of grey. We're going to thin this colour down into a glaze consistency and start applying it to some of the more shadowy areas of the fur. I'm applying this shade pretty broadly to the underside of the fur on the front and the back, and I'm also applying the shading in between each of the individual tufts to give that area some more definition too. Now we're going to start highlighting the fur up using a slightly lighter paint mix. Just like the shade, I'm going to be applying this quite broadly into the higher and lighter areas of fur at the top of his fluffy chest. And I'm building up this colour using little individual brush strokes which match the direction of his sculpted fur to mimic the look of real strands of fur on his body. On his belly area, where it's a bit more shadowy, I'm only going to apply a few little strokes of this paint quite sparingly onto all the individual tufts. To build up our highlights, we're going to keep repeating this step, but adding a little bit more Carrick stone into the mix at a time, and we're going to keep applying each lighter mix into a higher area of the fur, until it's pure Carrick stone in the lightest areas. We're going to finish off the fur area with a few final highlights of Carrick stone mixed together with off-white. Using this significantly lighter colour, we're going to use the same method of applying little individual brush strokes we used in the previous step, except this time we're going to focus them only into the lighter and higher points of the fur, like right at the top of where the tufts curve. We're going to avoid using too much of this lighter colour on the more shadowy areas of the fur, and concentrate them mostly on the tufts at the top of his chest, as this will help give the illusion that the ones underneath are a little bit more hidden and will draw more focus to the goblin's big old face. And with that, you now know how to paint saturated, high contrast and eye-catching looking goblins. All of the gradients and sharp edge highlights and shading that we did look great on a miniature of this scale, but this recipe will work absolutely perfectly on any greenskin miniature that you want to paint in the same way, big or small. And I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, thank you for being rogues. I'll see you in the next one. Bye! Bye bye!